After my wife died, her two sons took every dollar of our $42 million timber business. And me, the man who ran it with my bare hands for 30 years, I was handed a single wooden crate that smelled like cedar and rust. They told me it was a joke, a nothing, a nobody's inheritance. But before I drove away from the mill town I'd bled for, I pried open that crate one last time. Inside was a folded map, and in the corner, in my late wife's careful handwriting, were 4 words. Go to the ridge, Walt. What I found up there didn't just save my life. It tore their entire empire down to the studs. If you're just now finding this story, take a breath, because what I'm about to tell you took nearly 40 years to build and less than a week to burn to the ground. I've learned something in 71 years on this earth. The people you carry on your back the longest are sometimes the first ones to cut the straps when they think you can't feel it anymore. If you've ever given everything you had to people who looked at you like you were furniture, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened next, they never saw it coming, not for 1 second. The conference room at Halloran and Voss, the family's law firm in Spokane, smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Rain was hammering the windows the way it does in eastern Washington in late October. Sideways and mean. I sat in a hard plastic chair because the leather ones were already taken. At 71, after 4 decades running Bell Ridge Timber and Milling, my hands were cracked and scarred in a way no amount of soap could fix. They told the story of a man who'd spent his life pulling a living out of hard ground. Across the table sat Dale and Marcus, my late wife Loretta's sons from her first marriage. I'd raised them since Dale was 11 and Marcus was 8. I taught them how to run a chainsaw safely, how to read a grade stamp on lumber, how to shake a man's hand like you meant it. Dale was 52 now, a real estate developer who wore his jacket like it cost more than my truck, which it probably did. Marcus was 48, a man who'd never held a steady job longer than 18 months, and who still called Loretta for money, right up until the week she passed. The attorney, a thin man named Pierce with a nervous habit of clicking his pen, cleared his throat and read through the will in a flat, careful voice. Bell Ridge Timber and Milling, the 200 acres of harvestable forest, the mill itself, the equipment, the accounts, all of it, valued together at $42 million, was to be divided equally between Dale and Marcus. Nobody in that room gasped. It wasn't a surprise to them. It was a coronation they'd been expecting for years. Marcus leaned back and exhaled like a man setting down a heavy bag. Dale allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, the kind you give yourself in a mirror. I sat there and waited for my name. We had built that company together, Loretta and I, back when it was 4 employees and 1 busted-up skidder we couldn't afford to fix. I had put every dollar I ever earned back into that mill. I had slept in the office through 2 brutal winters, when the bank was 1 missed payment from taking it all. Surely there was something, a provision, an acknowledgement that I had existed. Pierce closed the folder. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small wooden crate, no bigger than a toolbox, and slid it across the table toward me without meeting my eyes. "This is yours, Walt," he said quietly, and something in his voice told me he was ashamed to be the one saying it. I lifted the crate. It was heavier than I expected, but still, next to $42 million, it weighed nothing at all. I pried the lid with my thumb. Inside was sawdust, a rusted iron ring of old keys, and a folded topographic map, brittle at the creases. 30 years of loyalty, 30 years of teaching those boys to be men, co-signing their loans, bailing Marcus out of 2 failed businesses, quietly covering Dale's gambling debts before Loretta ever found out. And I got a crate of sawdust and keys. Dale stood and buttoned his jacket with the calm of a man closing a business meeting. "Don't look so wounded, Walt," he said, looking down at me. "You were Mom's hired hand who happened to marry her. She left you a keepsake. Be grateful for that much." Marcus laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Yeah, enjoy your box of nails, old man. The free ride's over." Something hot rose up in my chest. 30 years of swallowed insults all trying to surface at once. I pushed it down the way I always had. I'm a man who measures twice and cuts once. I don't waste breath on fools who've already made up their minds. I looked at the 2 of them, their tailored coats I had quietly helped pay for, and I closed my fist around that rusted ring of keys until the metal bit into my palm. I didn't give them a single tear. "You have no idea what it costs to build something, Dale," I said, low and even. "You only know how to spend what somebody else bled for." Dale's jaw tightened. "Be out of the house by tonight. We're putting the Ridge property on the market by spring, and I don't want your junk cluttering it up. Don't make me call somebody to walk you out." I stood, straightened my collar, and walked out of that office into the freezing Spokane rain. I didn't know it then, but that crate of sawdust and rusted keys sitting on my passenger seat was about to blow their $42 million inheritance apart at the seams. The drive back to the house Loretta and I had shared for 3 decades felt like driving to my own funeral. When the timber market crashed back in the 90s and we'd had to let half the mill staff go, I was the one who spent that winter re-shingling our roof myself, freezing my hands raw so we wouldn't lose the house along with everything else. Every beam, every nail, every square foot had my sweat baked into it. The porch light was already off when I pulled up. Marcus's truck sat crooked in the driveway. Before I even reached the steps, the front door swung open, and Marcus stood there with my old army duffel bags already packed, my things spilling out where he'd stuffed them carelessly. He shoved the first bag off the porch, and it hit the wet gravel at my feet. "Get your stuff and get gone, Walt," he said, his voice flat as a plank. "Dale wants the locks changed tonight." I stood in the freezing rain, water running down my collar, my blood running a lot hotter than the weather. I didn't drop to my knees. I didn't beg for one more night under a roof I'd built with my own hands. I just looked at him. "I framed this porch the summer you broke your arm falling off your bike, Marcus," I said quietly. "I sat up with you 3 nights running a fever nobody else in this family bothered to check on, and I paid off the debt collectors calling about your restaurant before your mother ever knew it existed." He had nothing to say to that. The truth is heavy, and cowards spend their whole lives running from it. He just muttered something about me needing to leave and shut the door. I heard the deadbolt turn. Then the porch light clicked off, leaving me standing alone in total darkness at 71 years old with 2 duffel bags and nothing left to my name. I sat in the cab of my truck the rest of that night, running my thumb over the rusted keys, waiting for daylight. Loretta was tough in a boardroom, tough as they came, but she was never cruel to me, not once in 30 years. She hadn't left me a box of junk as an insult. She'd left me a puzzle. I just had to be smart enough to solve it. I unfolded the map at first light. It wasn't of the mill property at all. It was a stretch of forest 50 miles north, up near the Canadian border. Land I vaguely remembered Loretta mentioning once, decades back. Land her own late father had owned before she ever met me. In the corner, in her handwriting, worn soft by time, were 4 words. "Go to the ridge, Walt." I didn't bother trying to touch our joint accounts. I knew Dale's lawyers would have those locked down by 9 that morning. Instead, I drove to the small credit union where I'd kept a modest personal account since before Loretta and I married, an account neither son knew existed. I drained it down to the last dollar and pointed my truck north. The drive took most of the day, winding up narrow logging roads that got rougher the further I went, past the last gas station, past the last cell signal, until the pavement gave out entirely and I was following nothing but the old map and a set of coordinates scratched into the wood of the crate itself. When the road finally died at a locked gate with a chain rusted nearly solid, I got out and walked the rest of the way on foot, my old knees screaming with every mile. What I found past that ridgeline stopped me cold. It wasn't a shack. It was an old hunting cabin, half swallowed by blackberry brambles, roof caved in on one corner, windows long since broken out by weather and animals. At first glance, it looked like nothing, a pile of rot nobody would give a second thought to. But I'm a timber man. I don't just look at a structure, I look at what it's standing on. And this cabin sat square on top of a ridge that commanded the only clean sightline down into a valley of old-growth Douglas fir that stretched further than I could see, timber that hadn't been touched by a saw in over a century. I stepped inside carefully, testing the floor with my boot before trusting my full weight. Just as I crossed the threshold, my burner phone rang, the cheap one I'd bought at a gas station that morning. Only one person had that number. "Walt, is that you?" Dale's voice came through, warm in a way I hadn't heard from him in 20 years, the same practiced warmth he used closing real estate deals. "Listen, we feel awful about yesterday. Marcus is a wreck about how we left things. We know Mom left you that worthless scrap of land up north, and honestly, it's an insult after everything you did for her. We want to make it right. We'll wire you $80,000 today, no strings. You sign the deed over, and you go live comfortably wherever you want. You never have to think about that ridge again." I said nothing. Con men always talk too much when the silence gets uncomfortable, and Dale kept filling the space, sweetening the offer, growing a little more anxious with every sentence. My mind was working fast now, clear as a bell. Why would two men who'd just inherited $42 million, who'd thrown me out in the freezing rain without a second thought, suddenly develop this much generosity over a worthless piece of land? The math didn't add up. I hung up without a word and turned the phone off. I turned back to the cabin and began searching in earnest, running my hands along the walls, testing floorboards, the way a builder does when he knows something's been hidden on purpose. Near the back corner, my boot came down on a section of floor that didn't creak. I knelt, cleared away decades of leaves and dust, and found a panel cut with deliberate precision. No nails, fitted to lift free. Underneath was a small steel lockbox, dry and untouched by the weather. The rusted key from the crate slid into it perfectly. Inside was a thick folder, and on the front, in Loretta's handwriting, it read, "The truth about what your sons have been doing." I sat down right there on that cold floor and started reading. The first documents were a mineral and timber survey commissioned by Loretta herself nearly 15 years earlier. This ridge, and the valley of old-growth timber behind it, sat directly above a rare vein of high-grade quartz, valuable not for jewelry, but for the tech and solar industry, which had been quietly buying up claims like this across the Pacific Northwest for the last several years. A private mining and land consortium had already approached Loretta's estate lawyers with a preliminary offer. The number at the bottom of that appraisal made my hands go still. $61 million. This wasn't a forgotten scrap of nothing. This was the real inheritance. The $42 million sitting in the mill and the accounts back in Spokane was pocket change compared to what was sitting under my boots. The second folder explained why Dale had called so fast. Bank statements, shell company filings, wire transfers. For the last 6 years, Dale had been quietly siphoning money out of Bell Ridge Timber through inflated equipment contracts routed to a company he secretly controlled, and Marcus had been forging Loretta's signature on lines of credit against the mill's assets to cover a gambling habit that had spiraled completely out of control. Loretta had known. She'd known for years and said nothing to them, because confronting them directly would have dragged her name and the company through years of ugly litigation while she was dying. So she built something else instead. She quietly gathered every shred of evidence and forwarded the entire file to federal investigators 8 months before she passed. I sat there in that broken-down cabin and understood, finally, completely, what my wife had done. The $42 million wasn't a gift to her sons. It was a trap with their names already signed on it. By accepting that inheritance, they'd accepted every liability, every fraudulent transaction, every ounce of exposure buried inside it. She hadn't left me out of the will to punish me. She'd left me out to protect me from the fallout that was coming for the rest of them. I made my way back down the mountain on foot, exhausted, and hitched a ride into the nearest town, a speck of a place called Hollis Falls. I needed a lawyer, someone local, someone Dale's people had no reach into. In the folder was a name, Ruth Bennett, a mining rights attorney with an office above the hardware store. Ruth was a sharp, silver-haired woman in her 60s who looked at me over her reading glasses like she'd seen 100 desperate men wander through her door. "I don't handle family inheritance disputes," she said flatly when I finished explaining. "You need a probate lawyer, not a mining attorney. And frankly, you look like you slept in your truck." "I did," I said, "and I'm not asking for charity. My wife sent me here." I laid the original mineral rights deed on her desk, Loretta's signature at the bottom in blue ink. Ruth went very still. She studied that signature for a long moment, then looked up at me with an entirely different expression on her face. "Sit down, Walt," she said. "We've got a lot of work to do tonight." I told her everything. The will, the crate, the $80,000 buyout offer, the sudden warmth in Dale's voice. Ruth pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and started writing. "The consortium's been trying to lock down mineral rights across this entire ridge for 3 years," she said. "They've been rushing because a competing company is circling the same claim. If your sons found out what's actually up here, and I'd bet everything I own that Dale already has, they'd move heaven and earth to get that deed out of your hands before you understood what you were holding." We spent the next several hours drafting an ironclad conservation and mineral trust, transferring the deed into a structure that made me the sole irrevocable trustee, with a poison pill clause. Any legal attempt to force a transfer, sale, or challenge of my competency would automatically donate the entire mineral and timber rights to a federal land conservation program, permanently, with no path to reverse it. By the time I left Ruth's office that night, whatever Dale was planning, he was already too late. 2 days later, Back at my cousin's spare room in Hollis Falls, where I'd been staying, my burner phone buzzed with an email from Pierce, the family attorney. Dale and Marcus had filed an emergency petition in Spokane County Court to have me declared legally incompetent, citing early onset cognitive decline and claiming I had wandered off from home in a confused state, unable to manage my own affairs. If a judge granted it, Dale would gain full legal authority over everything in my name, including whatever I'd inherited. I read that email twice, standing in my cousin's kitchen with the phone shaking slightly in my grip. Panic is a luxury a man my age can't afford. When a roof starts to sag, you don't sit underneath it and cry. You find the beam that's failing and you shore it up. I called Ruth. She didn't sound surprised. That confirms it, she said. They know what's on that ridge, and they're panicking. People don't file emergency competency petitions on a Tuesday afternoon unless they're staring down a deadline that terrifies them. I used what little cash I had left to buy 4 battery-powered trail cameras from the hardware store below Ruth's office, along with 2 digital voice recorders. I hiked back up to the cabin and spent the evening mounting them carefully, one covering the doorway, one tucked under the eaves outside, recorders hidden beneath the old table and behind a stack of firewood. By the time I finished, that broken-down cabin wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a stage, and I was waiting for the curtain to rise. The next morning, I sat at that table with a cup of black coffee brewed on a camp stove, and around 10 o'clock I heard engines, 2 ATVs tearing up the old logging road that Dale must have paid someone to clear out just for this. I didn't move. I just watched through the gaps in the wall. Dale climbed off first. No suit today. Just an expensive jacket that still looked out of place against the mud. Marcus followed, sweating and jittery, glancing over his shoulder like he expected trouble. Behind them came 2 large men in matching dark jackets, hired muscle brought up from the city to make sure an old man understood he had no other options. They didn't knock. The lead man kicked the cabin door, and it splintered off its rusted hinges, crashing to the floor in a cloud of dust. They expected to find a frightened, confused old man. Instead, they found me sitting calmly at the table, my hands resting on either side of my coffee mug, looking straight at them. Dale stepped over the broken door, pulled a checkbook from his jacket, and slapped a pre-written check down next to my mug. A cashier's check made out to me for $500,000. That's more money than you've seen in your entire life, Walt, Dale said. Sign the transfer papers in my bag, and you can go live out your last years somewhere warm and quiet. Refuse, and we go back to Spokane and let the judge decide what happens to a confused old man wandering the woods alone. I didn't touch the check. My silence irritated him. He leaned in close enough that I could smell his cologne. You don't have a choice anymore. I froze the joint accounts. I filed the competency petition. Nobody's coming to save you out here. Marcus stepped forward, phone raised, recording. Say something confused, Walt, he said, his voice syrupy and fake. Tell the camera you don't remember how you got up here. It's okay. We just want to get you somewhere safe. I let the silence stretch, long enough for every threat, every ugly word, to land clean on the hidden recorders above their heads. When I finally reached out, it wasn't for the check. It was for the small digital recorder sitting in my jacket pocket. I placed it gently on the table, the red light glowing steady. Every word you've said since you walked in here has been recorded, I said, calm and even. And it's already uploaded off-site to my attorney's server. Marcus went pale and nearly dropped his phone. Dale slammed his fist on the table. You think a cheap recorder saves you? I've got a court date. I'm getting that land whether you sign or not. You can't sell what was never yours, Dale, I said. You committed wire fraud against your own mother's estate, and you just walked into a federal witness's cabin and threatened him on tape. The color drained from his face. I reached down and pulled the finalized trust documents from my bag, dropping them heavy on the table. This land is locked in an irrevocable conservation trust. I'm the sole trustee. If your competency petition succeeds, every acre of this, and everything under it, gets donated permanently to federal land conservation. You get nothing. Not $1. Before Dale could answer, Marcus's phone rang. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. It was Pierce, the family attorney, and I watched Marcus's face fall apart in real time as he listened. They froze the mill accounts, he whispered. The whole company, all of it. Dale's phone buzzed next, a call from the company's accountant, panic bleeding through the speaker even from where I sat. Federal agents had arrived at the mill that morning with warrants, seizing records, freezing every account tied to Bell Ridge Timber, opening a formal investigation into 6 years of fraud that Loretta had quietly documented and handed to investigators long before she ever got sick. The two hired men exchanged a look, turned, and walked out without a word. They'd been paid to scare an old man, not stand next to two men facing federal charges. Marcus slid down the wall and put his face in his hands. Dale stood frozen, staring at the trust documents like they might bite him. "You called me the hired hand," I said quietly. "You forgot that a hired hand is the one who knows exactly where every load-bearing beam in this family was hiding." Dale dropped to his knees right beside the check he'd tried to buy me off with. "Walt, please," he said, and I'd never once heard that voice out of him in 30 years, not even as a boy. "You have to help us. You know people. Fix this. We can split everything. Just don't let this happen." I looked down at him, 30 years of memories running through my head all at once. Every scraped knee, every co-signed loan, every lie I'd told myself that love meant enduring anything without complaint. I felt none of it anymore. "I'm not your father," I said. "I'm the man who paid your bills while you called me a hired hand behind my back. That's all I ever was to you, and that's exactly what I'll be from here on out. Nothing." I stepped back and gave a short nod toward the tree line. Ruth stepped out from where she'd been waiting, two county sheriff's deputies behind her, having listened to the entire exchange over a live feed. Dale and Marcus were arrested on the spot for trespassing, criminal destruction of property, and extortion, with the federal fraud case waiting for them the moment state charges cleared. Over the following year, the wheels of federal justice ground forward, slow but absolute. Dale refused every plea deal, certain his charm would carry him through a courtroom the way it had carried him through every negotiation of his life. It didn't. The prosecution played the recordings, laid out the shell companies, walked the jury through 6 years of forged signatures and stolen equipment funds. He was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Marcus, facing the same charges but with far less to lose, agreed to testify against Dale in exchange for a reduced sentence. He avoided prison but lost everything else: his home, his accounts, his name, attached to anything worth having. Last I heard, he was working nights stocking shelves at a warehouse 2 states away, sending most of what he earned toward restitution he'll be paying off for the rest of his working life. The consortium eventually came back to Ruth with a renewed offer for the mineral rights, $61 million, wired the moment I signed. I sat with that offer in Ruth's office for a long while. $61 million is the kind of number that reshapes a man's whole life, and I just watched exactly what that kind of number does to people who never learned to want anything less than everything. I turned it down. Instead, Ruth and I restructured the trust permanently, protecting the old-growth valley from any future mining or development, guaranteed by law for good. 3. I kept only a small parcel around the cabin itself, and I rebuilt it that spring with my own hands, tearing out rotted beams, framing new walls, replacing the roof plank by plank, the way I used to build things before the money and the family politics wore me down into someone I barely recognized. These mornings up here are different from anything I knew in Spokane. I wake early now, not because an alarm forces me to, but because my body finally rests easy. I sit on the porch I built myself with a cup of coffee, watching the mist lift slow off the valley, listening to nothing but wind moving through timber that stood untouched for over a century and will keep standing long after I'm gone. I think about those 30 years often, sitting up here. For a long time, I measured my worth by how much weight I could carry for people who never once asked if my back could take it. I told myself that was love. I was wrong. Love isn't enduring disrespect in silence and calling it patience. I know that now. I've come to believe that family isn't a matter of blood or shared history. It's a matter of respect, plain and simple. The people who actually care about you don't look at your calloused hands and see a hired man. They don't look at your gray hair and see an opportunity. I found more genuine loyalty in Ruth Bennett, a stranger who'd known me 2 days, than I found in 30 years raising 2 boys who called themselves my sons. If you're out there listening and you recognize even a piece of yourself in this story, if you're the one holding a family together while everyone else quietly plans what happens once you're out of the way, hear me clearly. You have every right to protect what you built. You have the right to change your will, secure your accounts, and tell the people using you that the free ride is over, no matter how long they've been riding it. You are not furniture, and you are not a hired hand. If this story meant something to you, Share it with someone who needs to hear that it isn't too late to stand up for yourself. Tell me in the comments, brother, sister, friend, wherever you're listening from tonight, would you have warned them, or would you have let them walk straight into the trap they built with their own hands? I'll be right here on this porch, watching the sun go down over this old valley, and I'll see you in the next story.